Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. I want to welcome you to the final episode of the sixth season of the Center's Religion and series. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and practitioners hosted by the Center to engage and enhance critically important conversations on the state of religion in America. The last episode was an exciting conversation that explored the questions of religion and data. Yes, I said exciting and data in the same sentence. We asked the question of how does quality data shape our interpretation of the religious landscape in the United States? I want to thank our host and convener, Erica Dahlhoff, our panelists, Bashir Muhammad, Allison Norton, and Gina Zerlo for a thorough and engaging conversation on the uses, deployment, and engagement of data in this current moment. If you didn't get a chance to catch it or check it out, please look at our YouTube channel or go to our website. And if you want to listen to this or any of our other episodes, we are now available everywhere you download your favorite podcasts. Today's panelists will explore a topic that I'm sure you've been hearing a lot of over the last couple of months. It's called religion and revolution. But before I go into the description for today, I want to share with our audience that today's episode is a teaser for our upcoming Biennial Conference. We're inviting all of you who are joining us online and who will watch this a little bit later to join us on June 4th to the 6th in Indianapolis for our ninth Biennial Conference on Religion and American Culture. The biennial will include presentations from emerging scholars who are just finishing up their dissertations, opportunities to network with scholars who think about religion and American culture from across the country and really across the globe, and sessions that will focus on some of the most pressing and notable intersections of religion and American society, including the state of the academy, how we are working to promote a more accurate depiction of religious life through media, and specifically, and why I'm announcing it today, panels on revolution and a panel on resistance that will engage and think about religion, resistance, and revolution in all of its complexity. And so we hope that you will join us. Please register today, register right now. The registration is live, as you see on the screen, and we hope to see you in Indianapolis in June. Now, on to today's episode. As the United States approaches the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, questions about revolution, past and present, take on renewed significance. So this special episode on religion and explores the many ways revolutionary moments have been shaped by religion, and in turn, how revolution reshapes or recategorizes religion itself. From the spiritual rhetoric of the American Revolution to the role of vodou in Haiti to the anti-clericalism in France, religion has often served as a catalyst for radical change. And today we have scholars of the US, the Haitian, and the French Revolution joining us today to talk about all of these intersections, overlaps, and really the important implications, not only for our past, but for our contemporary moment. I want to remind you that throughout today's session, we're asking folks to submit questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen. This will enable our hosts and our panelists to engage these questions as they facilitate this important conversation. Today's host is my colleague at the Center, Dr. Philip Goff. Philip is the Chancellor's Professor of American Studies. He has been the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture since 2000. His research specialization is American Religious History, with 8 books and over 200 articles, reviews, and scholarly papers in that area. He is dedicated to public teaching, and he has been a scriptwriter, a consultant, and interviewee for documentaries related to religion and American culture, and even the revolution for PBS, BBC, and HBO. Welcome, Philip. For our panelists, I'll start with, the panelist that's the furthest away right now from Indianapolis, Catherine Cart, who is a professor of history and the Altschuler Distinguished Teaching Professor at Southern Methodist University. I hope I pronounced that correctly. She specializes in religion in the 18th century British Atlantic. She is the author of Religion and the American Revolution and Imperial History, and an editor of the forthcoming volume, Revolutionary Turns, Religion and America's Founding Era. Our next panelist is Professor Jesus Ruiz, who is an assistant professor of the practice in Caribbean Studies at Vanderbilt University, where he directs the Caribbean Studies minor and he coordinates the fellowships at the Simon Collier Summer Awards. He is a historian of Latin America and the Caribbean, and his research centers on slavery, freedom, and Black political thought in the Atlantic world. His book, The Black Royalist, reinterprets royalism in the Haitian Revolution as a transcultural politics of freedom. And last but not least is my colleague who's just one floor above me, I believe, Daniela Castron, who is the chair of the Department of History and associate professor in history at Indiana University, Indianapolis. She specializes in the history of women and religion in early modern France and the Atlantic world. And she is a former president of the Society for French Historical Studies and a former fellow of the Nantes Institute for Advanced Studies. I am so excited to welcome all of you all to today's discussion. And now I'll hand it over to Philip to lead what I know is going to be an exciting conversation.
Thanks very much, Joseph. I was 12 when the bicentennial took place. And I have no doubt that I was influenced by that basically to go to study colonial and early Republic US. And so here we are at the 250th and thinking about what would be our last episode of the year in this webinar. It was very clear that we had to do something on the American Revolution. I'm very excited to have all three of our guests here today, whose work I admire a great deal. And so I think just to get things started, I might ask each of you to take just a few minutes to describe your work and basically your take on religion and your revolution that you work on. So we'll go in order of the revolutions. We'll start out with you, Kate.
Thanks, Philip, and it's just such a pleasure to see all of you virtually and get a chance to have this conversation. So as you said, I work on religion in the American Revolution, and I came to the questions I ask about that because the scholarship on religion in early America had tended to sort of overlook the revolution in many ways. Jumping from sort of the First Great Awakening as a religious event to the Second Great Awakening as a religious event. And then the politics of the American Revolution would sort of be left out of that. And because the First Great Awakening was a very transnational event, I was curious what the consequences of that war were to those transatlantic relationships. So I really got into this question through the study of religion. But once I started studying it, a couple things happened. One is that the story is far more political than I anticipated. The politics was in many ways more important than the religion. And I think the other factor that really became very clear is that because so many Americans believe that the American Revolution had a religious significance, there's a kind of irreducible importance to the topic that has a center of gravity. I just came from teaching a class where the assertion, Americans fought for religious liberty in the American Revolution is so central to what Americans believe. Factually untrue, but so central to what Americans believe. And so that center of gravity has made the topic just sort of perennially interesting.
Great, thank you. Dana.
Yeah, when you mentioned that you were 12 during the bicentennial, I was in college during the bicentennial for the French Revolution in 1989. And I was at Cornell University, where there's a big collection of French Revolutionary pamphlets that had been collected by the first president of that university. So I did research. I did my undergraduate senior thesis on the French Revolution, on songs in the French Revolution, and then when I went to graduate school, I did my master's on theater in the French Revolution. So I was very interested in the culture of the Revolution, and I ended up discovering, looking at these texts, that they were borrowing a lot of, say, the songs that became the political songs. They were borrowing the tunes from church and religious themes, and then reappropriating them as part of revolutionary culture. And so that's how I got interested in it, was this sort of desacralization question of the church during the Revolutionary era. But when I ended up doing my dissertation research, I ended up getting interested in this movement known as Jansenism, that at that time a scholar, Dale Van Clay, was really showing was influential in terms of the origins of the French Revolution, that the French Revolution was seen as a product of the Enlightenment against religion, but his work was showing how it was within religious controversies and debates in the Catholic Church itself, a lot of ideas that gave genesis to revolutionary structures and cultures was already taking place within the church. So I ended up looking into that and in the role of women in that movement. So that's where I'm coming from, interested in questions of the origins of the French Revolution and how the revolution itself has roots within the Catholic Church and within Catholic traditions.
Great.
Which, like for Kate, it's one of those things that people don't really think about as as associated with revolution. So.
Great. Please.
Yeah, so for me, I will say, just to kind of piggyback off of my fellow panelists, is I was 18 for the bicentennial of the Haitian Revolution, and so I come at the study of the Haitian Revolution from a sort of very traditional Latin Americanist perspective, which is to say, I wanted to know what the impact of the Haitian Revolution was in the wider, let's say, Iberian Atlantic world. And what I realized, as often happens, is the longer I stayed in the archives, and the archives here being in Spain, in Seville, the archives of the Indies, I started to realize that I actually was looking at that I needed to kind of flip the analytical point of departure, and that in fact there was something happening in this sort of borderlands of French Saint-Domingue and Spanish Santo Domingo that was about a sort of political theology that was highly influenced by Iberian Catholicism, essentially. And that there was something happening that was hybrid, that was also Congolese or West African or West Central African, right? And what I realized was that, in fact, the sort of the French monarchical reformism that happens kind of in the latter half of the 18th century or in the 1780s and leading into the Haitian Revolution was actually already happening on the island of Hispaniola in a different way, right? And so essentially I become really interested in sort of recalibrating how we think about, yes, royalism in the Haitian Revolution, long seen as a sort of aberration, something that didn't fit well within the sort of this idea of a Black republic, right? That's rooted in liberalism and Republican form of governance. And in fact, that there was something happening that was deeply rooted in what I call sort of Afro-Catholic political theologies. And so, Catholic language, ritual, hierarchy, symbolism, all of these things increasingly became more and more convincing or clear to me that they weren't incidental, and that actually they should be central to how we understand authority, legitimacy, and this is what really ruffles people's feathers is freedom, right? And so that became the sort of through line for me in thinking about monarchy, Catholic ritual, divine authority as something that actually was not at odds with revolutionary action in the Haitian example, but that was actually helping structure it throughout the entirety of the revolution into independence. And so it happens both on the French side of the island and on the Spanish side of the island. And the article that I shared for today was about a rebellion that happens in 1796 that I argue is deeply connected to that 1791 moment in French Saint-Domingue, what becomes Haiti.
Excellent. But I want to invite all of our panelists to ask each other questions as well. This is really conversation. I don't like to do interviews so much. So if you hear something you want a clarification on, or feel free to jump in. I will start with one thing because several of you talked about language and borrowing and things like this. So maybe, Dana, I'll start with you and then see if the others have other things to say. In the French Revolution, was religion more of an engine that caused political action, or was it more of a vocabulary that revolutionaries used to justify actions already underway?
That's a tough question to answer because the relationship between religion and the church changes a lot. And so, for instance, if we're going to talk about an engine, one of the reason that France is in a crisis, it helps to fund the American Revolution. They have this huge debt. How are they going to pay for this debt? It's by confiscating and selling church lands. So if you're going to look at it from a material perspective, you could not, like the revolution financially was in many ways driven by the property of the church. And once they appropriated it and then they started to sell it, people became literally invested in it and needing the revolution to continue. Because if it doesn't continue and then they have to give the land back to the church, they're going to have to pay this back. So there's literally this financial structure that just is always there and keeps the motor for it in many ways. In terms of the ideals of religion, the spirituality part of religion, that part is really interesting because at the beginning there is a sense that this new regime is going to have a church. Like people are not conceiving of a state without a partnership or relationship with the church, and they make a constitution for the clergy where the clerics are going to become paid civil servants by the government. After they execute the king, as things radicalize, and France goes to war with other countries in Europe, and the Pope condemns this constitution for the clergy, then you start seeing the revolutionaries having to develop their own. They've declared a secular state, and now they need to sacralize it somehow. They have to find their own sacred rituals, and so then that in itself becomes, in many ways, I think, self-generating in terms of new cultures, new calendars. They get rid of the Christian calendar. Year one is year one of the Republic. They get rid of the 7-day week and replace it with a rational 10-day calendar. So then there's this whole other cultural production that is needed to distance the revolution from what happened before. So there's sort of that material and then the ideological motors that change over time.
Hey, Sus, I saw you nodding your head and she talked about the spirituality part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I really, I think for me, one of the really important points is, and something that I want to make really clear in this work is that because voodoo has been so central, right, to understanding both cultural histories, right, of Haiti writ large, and really kind of a foundational cosmology to the Haitian Revolution itself. I think what my work is doing is it's not seeking to displace the sort of the centrality of voodoo and that sort of spiritual element from the historiography or from works, but rather to say, look, like we have centered this for so long, right? That we might be misreading the way in which just Afro-Catholic rituals, in this case, Afro-Catholicism being this sort of hybrid blend between Iberian practices and West African practices. And we're actually we're missing a really key element here, which is that, I think to me, it's more than just an engine or a vocabulary. I think it's in the case of Haiti, it's really religion is constituting the terms through which political action becomes thinkable. And I think I have my notes here. I don't know if it was Catherine or Daniela who mentioned or alluded to this, but it's giving a framework, right? And in this case, it's a framework that's rooted again in rituals, in kinship, in divine authority, not just to express political ideas, but to produce what I see as a production of authority in real time, right? In the case of the Haitian Revolution. And again, in our modern sort of sensibilities, it could be read as an aberration, right? The whole point of the Age of Enlightenment and in many ways, the Age of Revolutions is like we're doing away with monarchies, right? And we're entering this new sort of form of governance. And I think that's in part why in the Haitian case, there has been such an emphasis on voodoo, right? Because it is this sort of this aberration almost, and we forget that voodoo is also Catholic, right? And so, I think that it complicates that. I think in the Haitian case.
Kate, how much of that sounds familiar or different?
The American case is so different because of it's Protestant, right? It has such a different configuration. But the question that both of you are making me want to ask, or that I want to ask of both of you, is about legitimacy. And the reason I frame it that way is that in the American case, the revolutionaries are so committed to using what are really conservative religious elements in order to gain legitimacy, because what they're doing is so radical. And they're able to do that in large part because they're able to kind of harness this apparatus that is at a distance in some ways from the British system. But in the case of the Catholic Church, right, in both of the examples you're talking about, the locus of legitimacy within Catholicism is just really different. So I'm curious, when you say authority, for instance, Jesus, like where does political legitimacy come into this equation for the actors that you're talking about? How does religion lend them legitimacy, or is it a sort of structuring system outside of that, and they have to get the legitimacy in a different way?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would say the first thought that I have is that it is so. There's this famous quote from one of the sort of rank and file revolutionaries early on in the revolution, and it's when the French Republican envoys were there, and they were trying to recruit the insurgents to the French Republican cause. And it's this former slave named Micaiah, and John Thornton writes about this in his work and on Congolese influences in the Haitian Revolution. And Micaiah says something to the effect to the generals of, I am the son of three kings, right? The king of Congo, who represents my father, the king of Spain, who represents my mother, and the king of France, who represents. So there's this famous quote, and to me, that's the first thing that I think about is thinking about is that legitimacy is derived from the power of a monarch, right? And in the case of 1791, which is when the Haitian Revolution sort of formally begins, you can make the argument that it's 1790 or 1789 as well. That is what we see is this language of God and king, right? And so there's all sorts of conspiracies that are happening as to whether in the historiography it's seen as a sort of counter-revolutionary movement, by royalists. And there's a conspiracy that the King of France had given in his reforms, Louis XVI had given the enslaved in Saint-Domingue 3 free days out of the week off of the plantation, right? And that is why we see this sort of rhetoric, this church and king rhetoric. But what I'm finding is that all is there, right? That type of rhetoric, that type of claim to legitimacy, right? He is the ultimate, Louis XVI in this case is the ultimate arbiter of justice and rights for us, right? It's a sort of a reciprocal relationship. But what I began to see when looking at it through the sort of borderlands perspective, through the Spanish colony of Santo Domingo, is that it is more of is that reciprocal relationship, yes, it's still rooted in the power of a monarch, but it's also something that you can derive from your religiosity, if that makes sense. So you being a sort of practicing, a devout Catholic that has a certain crucifix on your uniform, right? Like you yourself can then become, by insofar as you are the leader of this insurgency, you almost have a sort of not a divine claim per se. I mean, well, maybe it is messianic in some regards, right? The sort of leadership of the Haitian Revolution. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying, if we look at it through the sort of Spanish or this trans-imperial lens, what we see is that it goes further than just having legitimacy from the sort of European monarch, right? You begin to yourself, in some ways, you are yourself a sort of quasi-monarch, right, as a leader of this revolution, and we see that, right? And then I think part of what I want to do with my broader book is to try and explain that, right, and to say how do we even get to an Henri Christophe in 1811, right? How do we get Dessalines as an emperor in 1805? Well, there are these processes by which, if we think of them in terms of political theology, that legitimacy begins to be, how do I say, like embodied through the leadership themselves, if that makes sense.
Donna, anything to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, this question of authority and legitimacy is really at the heart of the conflict over Jansenism, which is what my area of specialty is. And that the people have probably never heard of Jansenists, and the way I describe them to people is that they're the Catholic version of Puritans. So at the same time in the 17th century, you had a group of people wanting to reform the Church of England, which was an Episcopal church run by bishops in England. So you had that conflict in England. You had a very similar one taking place in France, but within the Catholic Church. So the Jansenists were sort of the equivalents of Puritans, but within the Catholic Church in France. And they wanted to return the church to its primitive roots. And they were also wanted to protect France from illegitimate uses of authority by the king and by the Pope, and defend what they saw as a French church, the Gallican church. And so you have a conflict over, it comes back to land, that the crown has eminent domain over land. And in the 17th century, Louis XIV, looking at what Spain is doing in the New World and claiming rights to lands with the blessing of the Pope and the regalian rights, Louis wants to do that in France himself and have greater control over church benefices and to dispense them to people who are in his patronage networks. And one of the ways he tries to seize control is by having people who are suspected of Jansenism sign a formula, a statement denouncing this certain propositions that are come from a book by Jansen. The heresy is named after this Flemish bishop named Jansen. So Louis XIV starts putting people to a test, that they have to swear sort of allegiance to a church, condemnation of Jansen's work, and if they refuse to sign it, then he will confiscate their land, invoking his regalian rights. And the response is that he has the authority over the land and he has authority over the church, but he's using this authority in illegitimate ways. And it gets very complicated, but basically the people resisting him say, we're happy to denounce what Jansen wrote, if it were to be heretical, but what you're saying is heretical doesn't appear in his book. So this is a question of fact, not of faith, and the king can't demand a proclamation of faith on a matter of fact. But it really comes down to, where does the authority lie for the king to enforce religious belief and doctrine? And so there are all of these doctrinal debates, but it is tied to land ultimately, and that the credibility of the crown is greatly reduced in these debates, because the people resisting him are able to show that he is not following the laws he claims he's following. He's not following the religious principles he says he's claiming to follow. So this whole Jansenist episode is seen as a factor in desacralizing the crown. But it is all tied to, how do you define authority? But not even just authority or not, but whether authority is being exercised in legitimate ways. I'm curious how, in the North America context, so the American Revolution, how these relationships between religion and crown and authority show up in your work, Kate.
It's a great. When you were just talking, I was just thinking about the sort of shared vocabulary there, that in the Puritan connection, I think, is a really apt one. I think one of the ways that scholars have been most comfortable seeing, and the public has been most comfortable in seeing, religious influence on the American Revolution is in looking at the way that particularly people in New England used those controversies, but also vocabularies to kind of work out, when is it legitimate to resist the state, that, sort of beginning with the premise that the Bible is a place where you can find truths about the way that government should be structured, and responsibilities of the government to the people and of the people to the government, that's an open question, that there is a just and an unjust prince, and that importantly, those questions are debated long before you get to the revolutionary crisis. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about the American Revolutionary case is you have this really well-developed, particularly New England, but also Presbyterian vocabulary of resistance that's coming out of Protestantism. But then the issues that are raised in the revolutionary crisis that actually ruptures the empire are utterly non-religious. And it's challenging before Lexington and Concord, it's very challenging for Americans to argue that anything as precious as their religious liberties are being threatened. Some of their political rights are being kind of abstractly threatened, right? But they have a very difficult time making that case. And the result of that, I think, for us as scholars, is that we have this example in this vocabulary that doesn't match what's actually going on. And then after the war breaks out, that language can be very useful, but we're left with sort of the engine of revolution not matching the language that's most appealing for revolution, if that makes sense. Kind of wondering if the people who are, the John Hancocks and Sam Adams of the world, right? Both Bostonians, right? People who are pushing for revolution, are they in some ways pulling a fast one on the population by convincing them that this is connected to some sort of essential rights question?
All right, so I'm especially interested in Haiti and the American colonies. How important was religion for mobilizing ordinary people, not the elites, not Hancock or Adams, but for mobilizing ordinary people into revolutionary action? There was the Black Regiment that we all grew up learning about, right? The preachers who would get up in their robes and whip people into action. How much of that was real, Kate? How much?
I was going to let Haiti go first. So how much of that was real? That's such a good and totally unknowable question. And I think one of the most frustrating things about the about the scholarship on this subject has been that we tend to sort of just assert, and Gordon Wood did this most famously, that people listened to what was being said in the pulpit. And they must have, right? We all know that all people are terribly obedient to everything that comes out of the pulpit. And I don't know that we necessarily have a lot of good evidence that people were primarily or instrumentally motivated by religion. We can definitely say that revolutionaries wanted religion to appear to be on their side and worked very hard to make that happen. We can find lots of people of faith on both sides, and we can find people who every religious tradition divides, right? So there isn't there are some that skew strongly one way or the other, but everyone has voices on both sides. So the churches do not become a primary organizational mechanism, right? So it would have to be a sort of theological mechanism, not an organizational mechanism. Um, the other thing that I think is really important is that we forget how long the American Revolution lasts, and I think this is something that we think of naturally with the Haitian and French cases, but with the American case, we tend to think of like the coming of the Revolution and then the Constitution. We skip over this, 8-year brutal war, in which people had to choose what to do over and over and over again. And often their congregations were disrupted and the theological questions were not necessarily clear. So I think it's a mixed bag. I think the number of factors that are pushing people in different directions is really huge. So I'm actually really uncomfortable saying that religion becomes sort of an ongoing engine of revolution as opposed to sort of a rhetorical strategy used by leaders.
Okay.
It's just too messy for that.
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
I will say, in the Haitian case, this is one of the things that that I'm kind of struggling with is the degree to which it mobilized people to sort of on the ground and just as you said, ordinary sort of rank and file folks. It is the case if we dive into the sort of long to not, to I don't know if this has ever been used in the same line, but the longue durée of a sort of the voodoo, as a sort of as a central element, right, of the Haitian Revolution. It is true, right, in that regard. Now, when we talk about something other than voodoo, whether this was a sort of Afro-Catholicism that is the early or the early, that it may be an early iteration of what would then become voodoo in the sort of nationalist light. I think for me, I have to think of it in terms of something that is enacted, right? That is more than just sort of rhetorical. In this case, it is rhetorical, to be sure, right? Especially when we think about the leadership, right, of the Haitian Revolution, the Toussaint Louvertures, the Georges Biassou, the Jean-François, early leaders. But at the same time, what does it mean when many of these people go fight as vassals of the King of Spain, Carlos IV, as auxiliaries of the King of Spain, and stay loyal until the very end, until they're executed or exiled in a faraway place, right? And so to me, it's a strange confluence between sort of rhetoric and political ideology in some regard. I will say, to me, when I think about mobilization in the Haitian example, and thinking about religion and Catholicism specifically, I think about ritual, affect, emotions, shared practices. So I see there's a lot of drumming that I'm finding in the sources in the archive, right? Dancing, processions, coronations, right? And so even kinship ties like godparenthood, right? Or patronage networks like that. I think that at its core is mobilizing. It isn't just symbolic. It isn't just something that's rhetorical. There is a sense of collective urgency, if you will, and those are all sort of at their core. They in this case, I'm finding that they are sort of Afro-Atlantic Catholic elements, right, that are shared in the sort of wider hemispheric traditions. So yeah, I think I agree with Catherine. I think it can be a little messy in the Haitian example as well. But I am seeing it in a sort of through a more embodied communal kind of force.
Great.
Yeah, I wanted to ask some more about that because what I understand Kate just saying was that there's just this real sort of disconnect between some of the language before the revolution and then during the revolution, which I know in the French case, that was how it was really seen for a long time by the historiography, that the historiography was so divided between sort of pro-revolutionaries and royalists who could not get along over what the legacy of the revolution was. But some more recent work on French revolutionary culture, I think, really shows how those concepts that come from religion in those debates become really central to people as they're trying to figure out what it means to set up a new nation. So, for instance, they understand, they've been primed under divine right monarchy to see themselves as part of this mystical body of a society with the king as the head and all the people is sort of making up the state. So that then when they create the nation, they're trying to, the French revolutionaries are really trying to think of how can we be this unified body. They borrow ideas from Jean-Jacques Rousseau about the general will, but that is the goal. The goal is to create some kind of unified mystical body where everybody is together. Or questions of representation. We had a king that was sort of the representative of God on earth who ruled over us. Well, now we have representatives in the National Assembly. What does it mean? They have these debates. What does it mean to represent someone? Are they literally embodying or are they just speaking for people? So these theological concepts become real problems. And even the execution of the king. Like, can you king? It was forever, what is it? Long live the king, right? The king is dead, long live the king. That the king had these two bodies, that a king would die, but the king monarchy persisted. Well, when you want to execute a king and end monarchy, like how do you redefine him first to make sure that he doesn't live on in that mystical idea of eternal monarchy? So they really don't even know how to try him. But do they try him as a king? Do they first try him as a citizen? Do they try him as a criminal? So all of those concepts, as they're trying to recreate their society, are being debated in terms of these theological, religious problems that they've inherited from what they call the former regime.
I think there's something really, really interesting here. Again, I'm going to come back to the same thing I said before about the difference between Protestants and Catholics, right? So how does religion operate as a category differently in a Protestant versus a Catholic country? And in the Protestant example, in the British Empire, the perception is that religion is absolutely sacred, absolutely essential, that there's one true faith, but that freedom of conscience and diversity in religious circles is just as precious. So what that means is that central to any discussion of religion is the perception of perceived difference from the person you're talking to. So that unitary state, insofar as it exists, sort of can't be religious. Right. Right. Even in 1776, right, as they're writing the Articles of Confederation government, you have political leaders concerned about religion causing division. So they're going to stay away from what categorically looks like religion to them, which I think may, and of course, the American Revolution is before the French Revolution, right? So it may open up space where they're doing different kind of work to construct nation, not in an anti-church way, but in a kind of, in our terms, secular way, right? Like religion can only divide us here, right? So I mean, theoretically, those concepts of nation and unitary sentiment are also rooted in the sense that there's one commonwealth, one body, but they're not going to call that religious, right? They're more conscious of the boundary, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm over assuming a shared Catholic context on the French side. I don't know.
I mean, I do think that the French like to say that the British had, executed their monarch 100 years previously, that they had
Mm.
sort of already
And
worked
they
through,
had, right.
that they were 100 years ahead of France in terms of dealing with some of these separations between monarchy and the nation. Um, but
Yeah, I want to repeat what Joseph said before. If anyone from the audience has a question, they can put it in. But in the meantime, I want to jump in on we've talked about religion's role in the revolution, but then what about the revolution's effect on religion uh, during it and then afterwards? How are things different? I know, Kate, of course, it's disestablishment here, right? But what are other ways, Jesus, I don't know, in Haiti, how is religion different after the revolution?
Well, it's still deeply Catholic. I mean, and it still very much is part of the sort of constitutional form of well, let me back up. To be clear, the first constitution, even before independence, is 1801, and that's the constitution that Toussaint Louverture sends to Napoleon. That then forces Napoleon essentially to send his expeditionary force to try and re-enslave the insurgents. In that constitution, Catholicism is enshrined as the state religion, essentially, and it's not quite an independence, but it's a quasi-independence, that 1801 Constitution. Thereafter, we continue to see the sort of centrality of religion insofar as the governing body goes and the enshrinement of Catholicism. It isn't until later that voodoo is recognized, right, as a sort of official religion, despite the fact that voodoo, of course, is widely practiced. I think it's really important in this case. I think you know I go back. I want to touch a little bit on the point that Catherine was making earlier about to try and better answer this question. To think about land as well. I think there is a concerted effort by scholars, both sort of Haitian nationalists and sort of, North American academics who have written about the sort of the separation between the state as it was created first as a sort of constitutional monarchy and empire, right, and then finally into this Black Republic and sort of the peasantry, right, and I think what I'm trying to get at is that where religion comes into play again is that in many ways, that peasantry, and again, this is early on, post-independence, leading not quite into the 20th century, is really rooted in that sort of voodoo tradition, right? Whereas what you see in the sort of urban and rural divide is that, Catholicism is a sort of top-down state religion. So there is, I think, a sort of class element too that we can speak to in the Haitian example, where the rural peasantry very much is rooted in that sort of voodoo practice, not exclusively, of course, but and so I don't. It is definitely. I mean, it's still generative, I think, both from below, if you want to think about it as a history from below in terms of voodoo. But I do think that early post-independence, the sort of Catholic element is very strong, both top down and bottom up. And I do think that, there is something that is shared there, whether it's sort of French reformist Catholicism leading into the revolution, or West African and Iberian, that really makes makes a strong sort of imprint on that early post-independence culture. Now, what we'll see later into the 20th century, right, is in fact sort of non-Catholic Christian denominations enter both, whether it's via U.S. intervention early in the 20th century or otherwise. That's going to then take a, have a strong effect as well on Haitian society. So, yeah, I'm not sure if I quite answered that, but
no, I'm loving this. Frankly, that we talk about religion and revolutions, and these are all three very different. I mean, they're happening within 20 years of each other, and just very different across the transatlantic. Get a question here from Daryl Washington. Is there a revolution in U.S. between Christian nationals, and what does it mean to be Christian? The myth of the U.S. as a Christian national is a false narrative, especially in this present culture. Interesting point right now, especially with the claims that are being made about the Christian roots of the United States. I do want to turn to you, Dana, and talk about how of all the revolutions, it seems like religion comes out looking quite different after the French Revolution, and the state kind of filling that role.
Yes and no, because after Napoleon, it goes back and forth in the 19th century between revolutions and restorations. But yes, France ends up being intensely secular as a nation eventually out of all of this. I think, well, the attempt of the Republic to complete there's the beginning of the revolution, there's an attempt to make it work with the Catholic Church and sort of have the new revolutionary government take on the role that the king always had in partnering with the church for things like the church did all the baptisms and marriages, all the civil law was taken care of by the Catholic Church. And then when the Pope came out against the civil constitution of the clergy, and then that divided the Catholics in France into those who were pro-revolution and those who ended up being against it. I mean, there's lots of shades in between, but it does really polarize to the point that we have civil war in France. And a lot of that is over religion. Then the Republic tries to just get rid of all the desacralization campaign, get rid of all signs of Catholicism and replace it with a natural religion. They want natural law, natural religion. And then at the end of the terror, you get this interesting little period that people are now starting to pay attention to more and more, but has been neglected for quite a while, before Napoleon signs the agreement, the Concordat with the Pope, where people are, they're sounding kind of like what I think Kate was saying about the American Revolution. Let's just keep religion out of it. Like, let's just have freedom of religion and let people practice religion and keep it out of the state. And in that period, you have a bunch of intellectuals trying to come up with some kind of syncretic religion. They're looking at Hinduism, and they're looking at Protestantism and Judaism and all these other religions. I don't know if they're looking at voodoo, but they're trying to look at all of them to come up with this sort of meta religion that everyone can agree on around a supreme being. So that doesn't last for very long, but you have these other movements in there with people really experimenting with religion. And then, but yes, then you come back to the 19th century, which is so tumultuous, but you do end up with France having this very powerful separation of church and state. And those debates have just continue on now. People have heard debates about veils in the schools and wearing cross necklaces and things like that.
Coming down the stretch here, but a good question has come in for Jesus and Kate. How did the transatlantic networks of co-religionists influence how religion evolved after the revolution?
I guess I'll go first. That's a great question. So what I found is that transatlantic networks were really ruptured by the revolution, and so in the post-revolutionary period, it's the people who are the most nimble with those relationships that are the most successful at rebuilding them, and that's actually one of the ways that you get a kind of what we would later call evangelical flavor to American religion, is because those are the people who are the most successful at rebuilding those next networks. But one of the things that I think is maybe an interesting contrast between these different examples is that the American networks that survive, or the transatlantic networks that are rebuilt, tend to be non-institutional. And of course, the Catholic Church is a very different kind of structural system there. And so I'm really curious how that works for Haiti.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think in many ways this is a very difficult question, but I will say I think for me one way to think about it is maybe less so as influence, and maybe more in terms of like an ongoing sort of reinvention across the Atlantic. And so I think for Haiti, whether we're talking about sort of Catholicism or Afro-Catholicism or other African diasporic traditions, I think religion didn't develop in isolation after the revolution. Again, as I alluded to earlier, it's the state itself is trying to kind of politicize it in some ways, right? So in some ways, it's almost the opposite of secularization in some regard, and I think these movements, these sort of African diasporic traditions, I think continue to evolve. There's a movement of people, of ideas, of ritual practices. And, I think for me, what's really interesting, having lived in New Orleans, and I always joke with my colleagues that, Duke was like my number one choice because I wanted to study Haiti. They had this great Haiti lab. And I ended up at Tulane, and I ended up, oddly enough, I think in the most perfect place to study Haiti. I see the way in which the connections between Haiti and Louisiana and even Cuba, right, and Western and Central Africa. We see the way that devotional practices continue to move across these borders, right? And these ritual forms and understandings of authority are constantly being reworked, right? And so I think I think about it more in terms of circulation, in terms of how these networks keep religion sort of dynamic and evolving, right? And especially when we think about something that's African derived, right? There is such a rich and deeply entwined sort of web of connections that I literally see when my family and I go to Mardi Gras.
Yeah.
In New Orleans, and I find myself back in, that rural town near Cape Haitian in northern Haiti, right? Like in a voodoo ceremony, but not quite that, right? And so, yeah, I think after the revolution, religion it's not something necessarily that settles. It keeps moving in other ways.
This has been really rich. I want to thank all three of the panelists for this. I will just give a quick plug again. The Biennial Conference that Joseph mentioned at the beginning will be June 4th through the 6th. And we're going to have another panel on religion and revolution. It'll again be the American Revolution and the Haitian, but then the third, in this case, is going to be the American Civil War, which was a failed revolution that ironically freed millions of people. So a little bit different spin on the conversation. So we invite everyone to come to the conference. Also on June 3rd here in Indianapolis, anybody who's local, we are teaming up with the Lake Institute and WFYI, the PBS station, and also Spirit and Place here at IU to have a night looking at the Ken Burns series and the role of religion, how it shows up there. We'll have several guests for that. So registration will be available soon. Just keep track of our website. Thanks again to the panel, and thanks for everyone joining us today. Take care.